Okay, so a word of prayer here. That was a nice chapel. That was really special. Uh, and I know that Joaquin's going to do a great job too. It's hard stepping into somebody else's shoes, but he'll do a great job. He's got the maturity, and just a really neat guy. I've got a chance to meet with him a little bit. All right, well, let's go ahead and pray. Thank you, Father, for the blessings of this day and for the joy of knowing Christ, serving Him, following Him, whether it's in a particular location or during transition time, like Noah and Nikki are going to be experiencing or are already involved in, and Joaquin coming in, and others who are new around here. And as we look at these missionaries who uh, had to experience transition and going from place to place, culture to culture, help us to appreciate their struggles, but also their ability and determination to trust you and follow you in it all. I pray in Jesus' name, amen. Excuse me. that donut's still going down the tube. All right, so I don't know, did we show you this map here? What a map! Okay. All right, hang on. This thing is just a moment. There we go. Okay. Did I show you this map in the class? Hi, Matthew.
I think we did look at.
Yeah, this is the kind of the Oregon Trail, and just you remember going out to the northwest. There wasn't any state of Washington at the time, right? It was the Oregon Territory, and but yeah, and those are a couple of drawings of the Indian tribe that the Whitmans dealt with. A hostile tribe, remember? And we went through this in Intro to Missions yesterday, actually, as well. So we were talking to the freshman students about it. And there's what it would look like today, Lapwai or Lapway. Actually, I had a student who lived in Idaho a couple years ago, and she gave me the right pronunciation, and I can't remember what it was. And then Walla Walla, California would be the current site closest to where the Whitman ministry was. You can see on the inset map over there that they were very close to one another by today's standards. Yeah. That's Walla Walla down there, the little dot there, and then up the top, Wapline. So you can still see memorials to the Oregon Trail. I don't know what else there is, but that's one shot plaque just talking about the trail. And then this is a photo that was taken in 1899 of the region where the Spaulding served. So did you notice how the teepees are all surrounding the settlement, of course, for protection, probably from competing tribes. There was tribal warfare. So I thought it was pretty cool to be able to find some shots showing where they actually served. Any photo from 1899 is, that's preserved is pretty cool. So do you notice the shadow there? It almost looks like there's a church in the background. That looks like a steeple down there coming out. I don't know if that's what that is, but could be something like that. All right, we're going to switch now to Protestant missions. And okay, quick little review. A Protestant is what?
They left the Catholic Church.
Right, they protested the Catholic Church came up. Now, in the colonies, there were two kinds of Protestants. What do you call those who chose to stay in and try to fix the Catholic Church?
Reformers.
Reformers. That's the reason for the word, right? And those who decided to come out and leave the Catholic Church in the colonies were called?
The Lutherans? No.
Pardon?
Lutherans? No. Hey,
No, Lutherans were actually among those who tried to reform it from within. Not all of them. The separatists. Okay, hence the name separatists. They were those who just realized they could not stay in and make changes. Okay, so so we talked about the Reformation, and just give me again the year that we usually tack on that for the beginning of the Reformation. 1517, Luther's 95 Theses, his protest against the Pope nailed to the Wittenberg door. And ironically, the upsurge in Catholic missions was in response to the Reformation, right? They didn't like what was happening. They were losing many people. And so they responded by, and the name of the major missions arm of the Catholic Church is? French word, means Society of Jesus.
Oh, Jesuits.
Jesuits, right. This is all review. You guys just being humble, you know all the answers, but you want to let, you only like one guy in the room, right? I mean, one student, so we'll let him do this. Okay, what was the Protestant problem? Well, remember that many, if not most of them, were landlocked. Germany, for example, there's no major ocean, right? And so they didn't have access to the trade routes and the ships and stuff that other countries did. Some believe that the Great Commission pertained only to the time of the apostles. And so they had no responsibility. And of course and who was the guy that we will study, but you already know him very well, who really helped to change that mentality?
William Carey.
William Carey. Remember that your midterm exam is going to be basically reading his inquiry and then giving me your thoughts on it as midterm. It's probably the simplest midterm exam you'll ever have. But I want you to read it because it'll sound like a no-brainer to you, but in this day, he was fighting uphill against guys that believe that we don't have a responsibility to take the gospel to the ends of the earth. So there were a lot of early attempts by a number of groups. The Quakers made an attempt to take the word into the world. And my grandmother actually came from a Quaker background. And why were they called Quakers?
Didn't they like? Maybe I'm confusing them with the Shakers, but like it
Same
was
basic
type
idea.
of like how they worshipped and they moved or something, or
Yeah, and they actually believed that when the spirit was moving, that there was actual shaking of some sort. Quakers and Shakers both kind of had that in common. They would look at a passage like, the book of Acts where the apostles go back and they pray and the place was shaken where they met, and so that's kind of the idea. They wanted they liked that visible manifestation of the Spirit's presence and movement among them. Then you have the Lutherans, and the Pietists were a subgroup that came out of the Lutherans. Okay, now we haven't talked about the Pietists in this class yet, did we? Maybe. Okay, who were the Pietists? Anybody remember that from the Western Civ or, There were probably a couple of other things you had to study in Western Civ also, right? So, okay, Pietist comes from the word pious, which is from the Latin for godly. So here's the deal. The Protestant mission movement started off really well, but remember that when the Protestant Reformation began, academics was becoming very big in Europe because the printing press, who invented the printing press? And you can help me pronounce his name. Gutenberg. Sorry, my German is, and it'll be Guten with the two dots over the U. Gutenberg, no?
I don't think so.
Okay.
I'm not sure.
Yeah, forgive me, buddy.
You're good.
And so remember that the Enlightenment is also coming about at that time, the very humanistic movement, the idea that man can shed his crutches, his spiritual crutches, and he doesn't need God now. He's coming into his own, so his mind is becoming enlightened and all that. So all these things, they impacted what happened with the Protestants and their missionary movement. And so slowly the Protestant Reformation became an academic thing. And that wasn't good. I mean, I'm not against academics, but it became overwhelmingly academic. And some of the spiritual fervor began to diminish. And so, so remember we talked about David Brainerd. And he tried to fight against that with some other students at Yale. And so pietists, these two guys are considered to be the founders of the pietist movement. They wanted to see the Spirit of God come back into the church, basically. We need spiritual fervor, we need zeal for the Lord, and we need an emphasis on spiritual godliness. And so they and others like them started this movement. I think that others gave them the name pietists. I don't think they gave themselves that name. Okay? And they established the Danish Hall Mission, which is in modern day Czech Republic. And there was a man named Bartholomew Ziegenbalg, which we will not study, but he actually was, is that German or would that be something else? Do you know that last name? Does that look German to you? How do you say that, Miriam? Okay, sorry to keep putting you on the spot, but I just would like to pronounce it as best I can. So, but he actually had a big influence on Count Nicholas Ludwig von Zinzendorf. And what movement came out of that? Who do you associate Zinzendorf with? Huge missionary movement at this period of time.
He went to India.
No, he didn't go to India. He probably sent people there. There's a huge missions movement that came out of this whole thing. The pietists and these guys, the school, they trained people at this mission. It was a school.
Was it the Moravians?
Yes, the Moravians. Moravia, the country, was pretty much the modern day Czech Republic. And they were the ones that really got a missionary movement going that was related to this pietistic movement here. And wanting to get really, missions fervor for God back into the church. Even today, the mission agencies that we work with have been, greatly impacted by the Moravians. And so let me, so here's some of these guys. George Fox was one of the, a Quaker, well known in early colonial history. William Penn, what do we know of William, besides the fact that he was a Quaker, what else is he known for? He founded a colony in the United States, which became Pennsylvania. Exactly. Pennsylvania, the state of Pennsylvania is named after William Penn. And then here's Philip Spener, who's considered to be the father of pietism. And
Is George Fox the Quaker Oats guy?
Yeah. Yeah. They still put that on the front of the Quaker Oats boxes.
Yeah.
Yep, that's that's the guy. Quaker Oats. I don't know why they call it Quaker Oats. I think that Quaker Oats was actually founded in Pennsylvania, Quaker, Pennsylvania. I'm not. So here's Ziegenbalg with his umbrella, and he. Now you mentioned India, Sharon. Is this why Ziegenbalg went to India?
I remember the language.
Okay. Yep.
I can't pronounce it.
And he served there. Tamil down there is actually one of the major languages in South India. This whole area is South India. Bangalore would be right around here. Josh Chatler would have been in this area here. But anyway, there are 3 or 4 major languages spoken in South India. So, hi, bee. You can stay there as long as you leave me alone. I don't like bees. I like them, but not on me. So let's talk about the Moravians. Their founder, if there is a founder, was Zinzendorf. But remember, he was influenced by the pietists, Spener and Franke. He went to their school. So there's a lot of connections here. He actually, I don't think I have this in your notes. No, but, okay, he was a rich guy. He came from a nobleman's, a nobleman family. And he came to Christ through the pietist influence, and he had a big, huge estate. I mean, lots of land and built, the guy was rich, okay? And because, remember when the Catholic Church responded to the Protestant Reformation with the Counter-Reformation, the Jesuits started going out, a lot of persecution of Protestants took place. The Catholic Church wasn't content just to compete. They wanted to wipe out the Protestant movement. And so there was a lot of, they had the manpower and the money, and they bought weapons, and they persecuted Protestant believers. And you probably know the story of Martin Luther, who had to, they tried to kill him. And John Knox, that was a little different. That was in England. But so anyways, Zinzendorf had this huge estate. And what he did is he opened his estate to receive refugees who were fleeing from Catholic persecution. And so they actually started a school there, and they ministered there. They even talk about a spiritual revival. They even call it kind of a Pentecost that they say took place on his estate. They weren't doctrinally right where we are. One of the things about the Moravians that you have to remember is that they didn't place a lot of emphasis on theology. They had basic teaching of the gospel, but they were reacting against the academic climate. And so their philosophy was, let's just preach Jesus. And so a lot of false doctrine did end up trickling into the Moravian movement. And with time, near the end of that movement, it actually became kind of mystical. They talked about, you may have remember reading it there, it talked about being little worms sucking the blood of Jesus, just trying to overly humiliate themselves, and that was one of their ways of manifesting spirituality, by just showing how small but don't view all Moravians that way. That came about later on. But the Moravian movement in general is pretty good. They did go to other places with the gospel. Look at the ratio here. 1 out of 60 Moravians became a missionary. Just stop and think about that for a minute. Look at your church. What's the ratio of church members in your church to missionaries? That's a very high number, 1 out of 60. Unfortunately, they sometimes would, like for instance, if a man believed God was calling him, but his wife wasn't so sure, and the kids, and didn't want to move them, sometimes he would just go by himself and leave his family behind. So there are some things that happen but they would just take their trades and go. They didn't believe in raising support as a missionary or a commissioning church. They just up and went. A very simple, view of what it means to be a missionary. For them, everybody was a missionary. You either stayed or you went, but you were a missionary. So when we talk about vocational missions and things like that, a call or whatever, that wasn't on their radar at all. Right? Yeah, self-support. Just pick up your tools and move to another place and make a living there while you're sharing the gospel. I told yesterday Intro to Missions, I got, all the freshmen, so several of them are organizational leadership majors. I talked to them a little bit about, I know that Mr. Hilla does this too. He cautions them, be careful if you're going to be involved in a tent making ministry where you're going to go someplace to establish a business, just understand the cautions that you need to be aware of. Because if you're going to start a business to survive, you have to make sure that business flourishes, or else you won't be able to pay the bills. So sometimes tent making can become overwhelming. It actually swallows up all of your time to do ministry because you're trying to make the business work. That is not to say that you shouldn't do tent making. It's just, you need to make sure you understand, you know, that it is gonna be demanding. You need to be prepared for that. Most of these guys were very simple. They were woodworkers or they were blacksmiths, or they just take their tools with them and set up a place to work wherever they went. And back then, you didn't have all the regulations like, oh, you can't come to our country and work because you have to have a worker's visa, you know, blah, blah, blah. That kind of stuff didn't exist back then. So it was much easier to move around and just start working. Yeah, there it is. Their philosophy of missions, every Christian is a missionary. Which, what do you think about that? Do you agree with that? That every Christian is a missionary?
I would say every Christian has, I forget the word, but they're supposed to go out and share the gospel, so they should be like an evangelist in some instance, or they should be like ministering and sharing the gospel with people around them, like neighbors and discipling people. But I think that's different than like a missionary per se.
Okay. Yeah. Yeah, and I would agree with that. If you say everybody's a missionary, then nobody's a missionary. I mean, you know, there's no distinction. And even though the New Testament doesn't make a huge distinction, Ephesians 4 talks about some who are evangelists. Who are they? You know, some are pastors and teachers. There seems to be some distinction. We can overstate the case and make too much of it. Yeah, I think that's a good way of putting it. We talked about this in Theology of Missions last semester. I don't know if you remember. We tried to come up with a definition of a missionary. If we have to, do you remember what we said about that? I thought it was in Theology of Missions. We talked about that.
What was your question?
What is, if you had to define a missionary, everybody has some relationship to the Great Commission, but how do you define a vocational missionary?
Was that someone who agreed to leave what they know, or like to go somewhere to serve someone specifically with sharing the gospel and other people support them?
Okay, it's that second part of your statement that I think really, because, I mean, others can go to different places, but when you are depending on that's your livelihood, when we say vocational missionaries, that's what we're normally, thank you, referring to. People who have no other business, no other means of support. That is their livelihood, being a missionary.
So then, like, a little different from this, but one of the girls in my apartment is a missionary to Japan. But in Japan, there aren't really, their goal is to have like Japanese missionaries. But just the way of cultures and stuff, most Japanese pastors and missionaries and stuff have to support themselves. And so then they had a business, it was a coffee shop. So then they're being supported, but they also have a business. Do you consider that missions?
Yeah, I mean, there are going to be you talking about Chloe? Yeah. I've had a chat with her about that too. In fact, her dad's coming and we're going to meet and chat. Yeah, they're still supported. They're with ABWE and, you know, they have supporting churches. There's a lot of discussion about this. I know that some agencies historically have said you can't go to the field until you have 100% of your support. You have to be fully supported. But some agencies in recent years have backed off of that just a little bit. And they're saying, okay, if you have other means of support that are legitimate, that aren't going to detract from your ministry, then you can also take advantage of that. So a coffee shop or, you know, some other kind of business to complete your support. Look, almost every home missionary, those who are missionaries here in the U.S. and North America, do exactly that. How many of you know a home missionary who has 100% of their support? Maybe you do. Most of them are almost expected to work another job to complete their support. In fact, over the years, some have actually complained about that. Why are we, just because we're not going overseas, why do we have to get a job? You know, and other people who go overseas don't have to, you know. Yeah.
I think too, having a job is just another good way to build relationships and connections with other people. So
It is.
whether you're here or abroad, as long as it's not too overbearing in your schedule, I think it can really help your ministry.
Yeah, you're right. It does get you into the culture in a way that some can't. Yeah, that is true. It's and it takes a lot of preparation to get that, to figure that out and get the right balance. How are we gonna balance my business responsibilities with? And in the coffee shop, that actually becomes a ministry anyway. It's not just a coffee shop, it's a ministry. Yeah, how do they say coffee? Kofi. Ask her. The Japanese word for coffee, I think, is kofi. We had some, we were there. So, the New Testament doesn't give us a really clear definition, that we tend to sometimes create categories that aren't really clarified. But I think that the concept of vocational missionaries is justifiable biblically, even if we struggle with fleshing that out and defining it. Okay, well, there's Zinzendorf, probably the most famous picture of him, and a statue of him as well. I don't know where that statue is. I'm going to guess it's in the Czech Republic someplace, because that's where he was. What's interesting about him? He never felt comfortable going and being a missionary himself. And some have criticized him for that. I mean, he was pampered. He grew up a pampered rich kid, okay? But one thing you have to keep in mind is that in a work like the Moravians did, you have to have somebody in a position like his to encourage and to organize, right, and oversee what these guys are doing. And so just because he didn't feel comfortable going doesn't mean that he wasn't burdened for the people in those places. He just didn't feel that was his gift set. Does that make sense? Some of you know the name Gary Anderson. He used to be the president of Baptist Mid-Missions. And Steve Anderson, his son, is one of our main speakers in conference this year. Gary Anderson was never a missionary. He was in the pastorate, and he was on the council of Baptist Mid-Missions, and they hired him to be the president. And there were some missionaries that weren't really comfortable with that, because most of the previous presidents had been missionaries themselves. And so, some of the criticism was, well, he doesn't understand mission. He doesn't know what it's like to be a missionary, so how can he relate to us? And somebody very wisely made the comment, sometimes what you need is somebody that has a different background, because you as a missionary may be lacking a perspective that they can bring to the table. And so even though he'd never been a missionary himself, he really helped to complete the puzzle by bringing his gift set. I mean, he was in ministry. You take a Dr. Jim, okay? Dr. Jim is, he was in church planting and in pastoral work, but he basically walked into the professional academic world when he became president here, And so he never taught. I don't think he ever taught in a Bible college per se, but he brings a gift set that's needed here and that complements what we're doing. So that's kind of the case with Zinzendorf. He had that combination. So let's talk briefly about it. He was born in 1700. He was a noble family. He studied under Franke. A lot of this is review. They founded the Order of the Grain of Mustard Seed. The idea there is that if each one does his part, even though we're all little seeds, God can bring about a great harvest. He broke the family tradition. Whoops. Because look, if you're from a noble family, you're going to go to some university and study something that's going to make you a lot of money and give you status in society, right? He goes to Wittenberg to study law, which would have been very pleasing to his dad. But while he's there, he sees a painting in the museum that changed his life. Does anybody remember about that? Did you read about that? Am I ahead of the reading here? Or did you guys?
I read about it.
Do you remember anything about that? What it said about the painting?
Something like, look what I've done for you, or something like that.
Yeah, here's the painting he saw. Domenico's behold the man, this man. I think is Italian for this man. That's it. And you might look at that and say, really? But God used it, and it just really got him thinking about serving the Lord that way. I'm probably not going to put this up in a missions conference and try to get people to surrender to mission, but, all right. And then he founded Herrnhut, which was his estate, but he converted it, remember? It struggled, and part of the struggle there, remember we said that they weren't super big on doctrine? So you had people fleeing Catholicism, Protestant people, but they represent quite a variety of theological positions, right? Followers of Luther, followers of Zwingli, followers of Calvin, followers of John Knox. Yeah, you had different people with different ideas all showing up at the same place. Some had more of a Pentecostal kind of idea about the gifts and all that. And so it was a struggle. The transformation is, they claim that there was this Pentecost, as I said, that took place. And whatever that was, it brought a fresh new unity to the group and a zeal. So, I don't have any more details about that. But it did start a prayer vigil that continued for 100 years. Now, how they documented that, I can't tell you. It's just seems to be an accepted fact that a lot of prayer in the Moravian movement for missions. And then he struggled with the uncivilized. As I said, he was kind of pampered as a kid. I mean, he just really had a hard time seeing himself going out to the native tribes and reaching them with the gospel. But he supported and encouraged and helped those who did. He trained missionaries, not theologians. Do you see anything wrong with that statement? Is any red flag there?
It's like, I'm not really focusing on like the doctrines or the Bible theology statements very well, so then they just, I don't know, they would just struggle to, I don't know, train people in what's actually true.
To make it sound like theology isn't important.
Or like it's separate.
Yeah.
It should be together.
So this guy, the missionary, is taking a message. Well, what message? Well, that depends on this. I think some people get scared away by theological terminology. We talk about dispensationalism. We talk about pneumatology and hermeneutics and all these words. And some people think, can we just talk about Jesus, just love Jesus. See? So I think it's an inappropriate reaction. But anyway, yeah, we've got to know what we believe before we can take what we believe to other people. So that was a weakness in their system. And they diminished the importance of the family. Your family is an earthly, temporary relationship. But taking the gospel to the lost trumps the importance of the family. All right, and then, as I mentioned,
Sorry.
oh, go ahead, sorry.
Also, like for the family, is it saying Zinzendorf diminished the importance or like the overall movement?
The movement, this is the movement, yep. Yeah, I'm sorry, it says Zinzendorf here, but he probably would have, I don't know what his view of his family was. He didn't travel, so he probably didn't have to deal with that issue. But the movement he represents, yeah, tended to do that. And I'm not saying they just forgot about the family altogether, but they were willing to do some things that would separate families and even marriages, to take the gospel someplace. All right, so there's Herrnhut, and means watch, Lord's watch, something like that. Is that a compound word? Lord's watch or Herrnhut? Anyway, there it is, and that's Moravia as it was back then. So it would bleed into some other countries today, but by and large, the Czech Republic. So Hull was, you see the distance, he studied at Hull with Spener and Franke, the pietist leaders. By today's standards, that'd be a 2.5 hour drive. So you know, that's a long way when, back in his day, you're going by a horse. Take a lot longer. Have you ever been to either of these places? Okay,
I don't know.
let's see. I would love to go there someday. Only place I've been is Frankfurt Airport. There's Frankfurt. Now you don't live, is it you or, which one, is it you or Cor that lives close to Frankfurt, or neither one?
One of us, we live down, there's Augsburg, like you can barely see it, and then it's still like an hour from Augsburg.
Oh.
So we're down there. The Snells.
That's who I'm thinking of,
Yeah.
the Snells. They live close to Frankfurt,
Yeah.
don't they? Yeah, that's right. Yep. Cool. So there's somebody back in the day drew a sketch of what his estate looked like. You can see lots of buildings, lots of territory, of course fields because they had to grow their own food and all that. No Hy-Vee or Aldi. Fairway. All right, let's talk a little bit about Christian David. We might not get through this, but Christian David is an interesting gentleman who lived about the same time. Well, he was born actually 10 years before Zinzendorf. Zinzendorf, 1700. It's an easy one to remember. Christian David was born in Moravia in 1690. And let me just go past that. And he actually became a convert to evangelical Christianity. And then he had a relationship with Zinzendorf. Actually, what he did, he kind of became one of the, leading missionaries that would go out, and he helped bring people, part of his ministry was helping to bring refugees back to the state. And so, a lot of refugees wouldn't even have known about this estate. And so one of the things is that Christian David did was help people to find their way there. But he also was commissioned to go to Greenland. You guys know the relationship between Greenland and Iceland, right? So which one's cold and icy? Greenland. So why are they switched around? Anybody have to remember from your history?
I know, I'm forgetting his name, but Leif Erikson's dad went to Greenland because he was banished from Iceland and he didn't want to live there by himself. And so then he called it Greenland and made it sound really amazing. People would come and live
Okay.
there.
Yeah, just change the name so it sounds like a neat place to go. Never mind it when you get there, you don't see anything green, right? Yeah, interesting. He had a burden to evangelize, Christian David did. And when he got there, he wasn't prepared for what happened. Okay, does anybody remember what he discovered when he got there?
Oh, wasn't this there was a mission established there? I don't remember the name of the guy, but he heard that this guy was gonna quit, give up, and leave, and so then they were coming to take over for him, and he wasn't actually leaving, and it was all just miscommunication.
Yes, because the guy who was there was Hans Egede, however you pronounce it, Egede, however you would say that. And where was he from? Was it Norway or Sweden or Denmark? I think he was Danish, but I'm not totally sure. Anyway, the king in his home country had supported his ministry in Greenland. He was there because his country actually paid his salary. But that king died and another king took over, and that king was not in favor of the missionary work there, so his support was cut. And so the word got around all over Europe, because this guy apparently was fairly well known, that he was leaving because he had no more support. But he didn't leave. He stayed there. And so Christian David thinks that he's going up to Greenland as the only missionary. He'll be all by himself up there. And he gets up there and he discovers that this guy is still there. And he'd been there for 10 or 15 years. I don't remember exact amount of time, but And so there's a bit of a conflict because Christian David is more Moravian in his way of viewing things, right? Very much more loving. I shouldn't say loving. That's probably, his approach though was a much more relational approach, whereas Egede was more of the Protestant mindset of academics, teaching them scripture, getting them involved in Bible studies and theology and all that. And they didn't see eye to eye. And so Egede felt threatened by Christian David because Christian David thought Egede had no heart. He's just teaching them theology. And Egede thought that Christian David didn't know anything. He's just up here to, to preach this sugar-coated message about Jesus. And so they had a hard. Now, thankfully, they actually did end up being able to work together with time. It took time, but they did end up cooperating with one another. And one of the problems with Christian David, he's the new guy, right? Because I think it was 10 or 15 years that Egede had already been there. And so, but he came with a new guy and he wanted to impose his way of doing missions. And just one of the things I would tell you from that story, one of the biggest lessons from this story of Christian David is be careful if you go as a new missionary or, wherever the Lord takes you, that you don't rush your agenda. If you think there's a certain way of doing things or you think that the way they're doing it is not the best way, I'm not talking about theology, I'm talking about pragmatics here, methodology. Be careful that you don't just jump in. Christian David didn't seem to be very patient. He wanted to insist that it be done the way he wanted to do it. That made Hans feel defensive. This new guy is coming and trying to take over. That has happened on the mission field more than once. A young guy comes out of college and seminary, he's all excited, and he goes to work, a place where there are people have been there for years. They may not be as well educated, or whatever. And they try to tell them what to do. We got to fix this. You guys aren't doing the job. Look at, there's no fruit, blah, blah, blah. And that's what happened. But they did end up being able to work out at least most of their differences. Yeah. So there's speaking of donuts. Yeah. I don't remember if he was from a Lutheran church. I don't recall. But that's a drawing of him. Really quick, we only got about 2 minutes or 3. He was born in Norway in 1686. There you go. It was Norway. And he arrived in Greenland a decade ahead of, all you gotta do is wait. I can answer all my questions, right? A decade ahead of David. He had had previous ministry struggles himself and just had a hard time as pastoring a church and got discouraged. But then he went to Greenland and even in Greenland, he had a hard time because he was dealing with Eskimo kind of people and they just weren't highly educated and they weren't interested in studying, sublapsarianism and superlapsarianism and all that stuff, right? And he had some previous, he would go into their tents in the wintertime, which was almost all year round. And they would often heat their tents with urine from whale urine, I can't remember, but or seal. Right? It had a really strong urine smell, and it offended him, and he offended the people when he commented about it. So there were some struggles. He actually had to make a 4-year trip to get to Greenland. He experienced culture shock, but interestingly, his sons started developing relationships with the Eskimos that he was not able to. They were young, they weren't as intimidated. A lot of times children on the mission field can open up doors that the parents cannot open themselves. Pretty fascinating. And God used his sons to really open up doors and they started writing songs. They discovered that if they wrote songs that the Eskimos could learn, then it created a certain bond with them. And then I mentioned the change in kings in Norway, right? So he lost his support when the new king came in. Okay, I'm going to save the rest of it till later because it's time to go. We're pretty well caught up. So Friday, don't forget 2 chapters. have the quiz over, and we'll discuss the reading, so make sure to write down like 3 observations, three discussion points from the reading that you think would be interesting to talk about, okay? Thank you very much.